Today on Inside Utah Politics, the race for Utah's Senate seat in our continuing series. Riverton Mayor Trent Staggs is hoping to fill the spot. Hear what he has to say about issues like economy and immigration. Plus, former political consultant Carolyn Phippen is also in the race. We're checking in on her campaign to replace Senator Mitt Romney.
And hordes of people surrounded the airport as they tried to flee for their lives.
The Afghanistan exit debate. Congress grills top generals on America's pullout from its longest war.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us here, everybody. I'm Brian McElhatton. Let's go inside Utah politics now, shall we? We're tracking Utah's Senate race by talking one-on-one with a very long list of candidates. And joining us today is Trent Staggs, the mayor of Riverton. Welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be with you, Brian.
So glad you're here because I'm curious, you have been a city council member.
Yes.
Now you're the mayor. How would you translate the experience and such the most local of local politics into a Senate career?
Oh, well, I think that's a fantastic question, and we've been talking about it for a long time on the campaign trail. And I think being in this position as a mayor, understanding local governance, that's what our founders envisioned. And they thought that, look, we have few and defined roles the federal government should be doing. Everything else left to the states and to the people. And so I say nobody understands that better than a mayor. I think it's the most accountable, perhaps the most transparent elected office. I'm always out there meeting with my constituents. And so someone who understands that local government, and I've been pushing back against federal, state, and county overreach for 10, now going on 11 years. That's what we need back in D.C.
I want to ask you about an issue that's so important to all of Utahns. This is one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. It's expensive everywhere. It's expensive. This place in particular has been hit hard over the past few years. If you were to be elected to the Senate, what do you think your role could be? What do you think the federal role could be to help us find solutions to this problem here?
Yeah, well, I've advocated for many in my mayoral role, but at the federal level, one of the biggest issues we have in the state is that the federal government owns or controls 2/3 of our state. I mean, it's really incomprehensible when you compare it to other states across the union.
It's a big landholder here.
It is. And so when you have such a constrained and limited footprint upon which you can build, that exacerbates the issue. And I think Senator Mike Lee has really been out there leading, has different ideas about how we can develop certain areas of federal lands that are developable.
Maybe some BLM land we're talking
absolutely,
about?
Yeah. Absolutely. And that could help out, I think, tremendously in taking off some of the pressures that we've seen with respect to housing.
Mm-hmm. I know we've seen the governor and his push for, I think, 35,000 new starter homes here. $350,000 and under is the price range he's aiming for. That's a local solution there. Yeah. Other than maybe making federal land available, what other policies would you support or would you push for that could help Utahns just afford to live?
Yeah, well, I think there are many at the local level, and that's what we've been advocating for. I've been pushing back. I think, unfortunately, we've seen many that want to push down higher densities and just populate certain areas with high-density housing, and I've been pushing back against that. We need better infrastructure. That's also something on the federal side that we can do. We need to be able to connect our various areas of the state more just in a better way. And that's something that we can definitely do with respect to infrastructure so that we're building out more broadly across the state and not focusing just on along the Wasatch Front and thinking everything has to be packed into this area. But locally, I mean, there's many different things that I've advocated for. I think, the illegal immigration issue definitely takes a toll on the housing availability here. You have the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity that I think is importing tens of thousands of people, jobs that are coming from outside the state. These people are of immediate home buying age, and they're putting a lot of pressures on the housing market. So those are things, and I think also I've called out Wall Street landlords. I mean, the Utah Association of Realtors has said that about 16 to 20% or more of our single-family homes are actually owned by corporate interests. And so, if you ended up putting that much more supply into the housing market, readily available for individuals and families to purchase, that is also going to help out with the issue. So those few policy changes, I think, would go a long way in terms of making the supply of housing more readily available.
You mentioned immigration, right? And there, I see two issues right now, and I want to address both of them if we have time. There's securing the border, which we're hearing a lot about right now, a lot of people coming across the border, a lot of people being apprehended.
Yeah.
And then we have the system itself, the immigration system. It can take 10 years for someone to apply and go through the system legally. Let's start there. Where do you see the problem in the immigration system as it stands, and what would you do to try to make it more efficient if that's where you want to tackle that?
Absolutely. I've conducted so many town halls. I've been in this race the longest, out of anybody. We announced my candidacy back in May. We were the only ones willing to take on the establishment and take on, challenge Mitt Romney. He hadn't decided whether he was going to seek re-election or not. And so we've been at this a long time, and I've probably done 70, 80 town halls across the state. And I've heard from those folks who may have their spouse, maybe somebody from another country who has immigrated here. They're trying to do it the right way, but unfortunately it's taken 12 or 13 years. They've paid tens of thousands of dollars to immigration attorneys. That's not right. If somebody wants to come to this country and actually, pledge allegiance to that flag, they want to assimilate, become a part of our culture, we should be able to do that much more quickly than 12 to 13 years and have to pay all this money to immigration attorneys. But first and foremost, with respect to border security, we've got to secure the border. And it worked under President Trump, and that's why I've been so, first one to endorse President Trump. I went out last summer and said we need his strength back in office because he had policies that worked. Build the border wall, remain in Mexico policy, I think E-Verify, ensuring that all these benefits aren't made available to illegal immigrants, because there's a big magnet that magnetizes so many folks here, and that's something that we can address and should work at the federal level, but also in conjunction with various states to ensure that they have policies that are not magnetizing folks, but rather encouraging them to go through a more orderly process to become a citizen here. Now,
President Trump, of course, one of his big tent poles there on immigration and border security was building that wall, and it was not completed. We know that. There are sections of it in place right now. If you were to take office, would you support the completion of that wall?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we've had politicians in D.C. that are more concerned about Ukraine's borders than our own. More concerned with borders in other countries than our own. We're looking at about $5 billion to finish that wall. We need to. It works. Look at what's going on in Texas. And that, Brian, that's the biggest issue that I see in this race. We need people that have demonstrated the resolve and the ability to push back against the establishment. We need those people representing us in D.C., not people that are just going to go back there and become part of the establishment. And that's typified my career, whether in business or whether in the last 10, 11 years in elected office for Riverton. I've always been willing to stand up and push back, and whether that's the only one running, being willing to challenge Mitt Romney in this race before he decided not to seek re-election, rejecting lockdowns and mask and vaccine mandates as a mayor, fighting against ESG, inappropriate materials in school, the high-density housing issue that we've talked about that I've been leading on. So many issues where I've stood up and pushed back against the establishment. That's what we need. Somebody's going to go back there with Mike Lee and give us a true constitutional conservative. Utah deserves that. We deserve to have another constitutional conservative.
Let me ask you again. You said $5 billion roughly to finish the border wall. Where does that money come from? I think President Trump, he took the money from the Pentagon. That was some defense money that he used. Right. Where would you take where would you want that to come from, the $5 billion to finish the wall?
Well, that's something that I think there are plenty of things that we could do. We're funding so many different programs right now. The UN, for example, is $16 billion, and I've been advocating defunding the UN. There's a lot of areas in D.C. that we can look to cut. The Department of Education, for example, is $80 billion a year. And on my website for the past 10, 11 months, I've been campaigning. I've said we should be getting rid of the federal Department of Education. There's no constitutional directive for it. We should leave everything to the states and to parental control, because I say parental control isn't just priority A, it's priority A through Z. And so they're just a few examples, but we've got to have people that go back there that have the courage and are willing to take on the establishment and find those areas where we can cut, because $34+ trillion in debt, this is out of control. When I launched my campaign, we were at $32 trillion in debt. It's a huge issue. I've had to balance my budget every year, 10, 11 years now, running my community. DC seems to think they're exempt from that. And we've got to have folks that have that experience, that have actually balanced budgets, that have run a payroll, that can go back there and work with our Republican caucus to get something done. So we really have to have President Trump back in office, and we have to have true conservatives, America First patriots that are going to go back there and work for we the people. And that's why we had Senator Tommy Tuberville out here recently, only one in the race that has a sitting U.S. senator that's endorsed my candidacy. And that's what he talked about. He said, Trent, right now we've got 15 to 18 Republicans that are part of the steering committee, which is kind of the equivalent of the Freedom Caucus on the House side. We need at least a half a dozen more. And he said, I'm the one in this race. He's vetted everybody. I'm the one that he is assured will go back there and be able to stand up to the cabal and the establishment in D.C., and he's got about another 6 or 7 other folks across the country that he's trying to get elected that will really go back there and be able to make a difference.
Okay, Trent Staggs, Mayor of Riverton, we appreciate your time today. Wish we could talk more. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, still ahead on Inside Utah Politics, a drug meant to treat large animals is being linked to drug overdoses. Find out the restrictions lawmakers are now demanding for xylazine. And then the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, what ex-military leaders who led that mission are saying in front of Congress this week. Well, welcome back. Former top military leaders who led the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan spent hours testifying before Congress this week. Our Washington correspondent Maddie Biertemple reports on that rare public testimony.
Republicans blamed President Biden for the deadly and chaotic Afghanistan exit.
The White House refused to listen to warnings about the situation on the ground.
Texas Congressman Michael McCall pointed to military leaders' advice to keep some troops in Afghanistan. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, says that could have prevented the Taliban takeover.
That it was only a matter of when, not if, the Afghan government would collapse and the Taliban would take control.
The Taliban retook control of Afghanistan just weeks after the last American troops left. During the evacuation in August 2021, an ISIS suicide bomber killed 13 U.S. service members and more than 60 Afghans, while thousands were evacuating at Kabul's airport.
Desperate Afghans fell to their deaths from airplanes, and hordes of people surrounded the airport as they tried to flee for their lives.
The retired military leaders say that evacuation order should have came earlier.
And that was too little, too late.
It is my judgment that it was far too little, far too late.
But Democrats on the committee blame former President Trump for agreeing to withdraw troops while he was in office.
Trump promised the American people every single American soldier would be out.
Milley said the 20-year war should be looked at in its entirety. He said no one could actually say when a withdrawal could safely be completed.
The fundamental tension facing the president, in fact, 2 presidents, was that no one could satisfactorily explain when or even if those conditions would ever be met.
In Washington, Maddie Biertemple.
During questioning, General Milley also said it's unclear how many Americans were left behind in that evacuation. He said the number there to begin with was never known. Turning now to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, they're saying xylazine has a growing role in overdose deaths across the country. Have you heard about this drug? Washington correspondent Rashad Hudson talks to one senator who has a plan to cut down on these overdose deaths.
Ohio Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown is pushing a bill to crack down on the misuse of xylazine.
We want to make sure that xylazine is not so readily available to drug dealers.
The synthetic drug is normally used by veterinarians to treat large animals. Brown says it is being mixed with fentanyl and humans are using it. He's concerned that xylazine is getting into the wrong hands.
That's a serious problem for people that potentially overdose.
His Combating Illicit Xylazine Act would make it a Schedule III drug and enable the DEA to track its manufacturing while also making sure veterinarians and farmers still have access to it. He says the bill has been endorsed by 39 state attorneys general, major law enforcement organizations, and veterinarian groups. According to the CDC, last year, more than 2/3 of the reported drug overdose deaths in the U.S. involved synthetic drugs.
This stuff is not easy to manufacture.
Ohio Republican Senator J.D. Vance says many of these synthetic drugs, like fentanyl, are coming from China. He is calling on the Biden administration to do more to stop it.
And unfortunately, the Biden administration, I think, has just been really weak on this issue.
The Biden administration says it is putting pressure on China to crack down on the manufacturing of these drugs. Reporting in Washington, Rashad Hudson.
Coming up on Inside Utah Politics, we're sitting down with Utah Senate candidate Carolyn Phippen, what she's sharing with us about her decision to enter the race. Hey, welcome back, everybody. We continue our coverage of Utah's U.S. Senate race by talking one-on-one with the candidates. It's a continuing series here. And today, Carolyn Phippen joins us for a conversation on Inside Utah Politics. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
We're glad you're here. Look, you have experience in politics. You worked with Senator Mike Lee. You've worked on campaigns. You've advised campaigns. So you are no stranger to politics. I wonder why you want to jump into the fray and actually take office.
Yeah. So I got to tell you, it's not a huge desire of mine. Here's what it comes down to. There are difficult things that need to be done at this point in time. I would so much rather, I'll tell you, last year I built a greenhouse and bought chickens because I don't trust the Biden economy, by the way.
It's a very pandemic thing to do, by the way, but yeah.
This is true. I would rather be living my life with my family and in my garden and having my nice job that I just left in order to run. But it is a time, I think, in our nation's history where we need good people to do hard things. And this, to me, is a better thing and an easier thing than watch everything that has been built over the generations in this nation crumble as a result of elitist politicians who make decisions in such a way that we are all impacted. We are $34.5 trillion in debt. I will tell you, when I first entered this race, we were about $32 trillion in debt. And that was in November of last year, right? We have a southern border that is being completely overrun. I spoke with federal agents here in Salt Lake just the end of last year, and they told me that we have Venezuelan gangs all the way from St. George up to Logan.
Well, let me ask you about that. Let me ask you about immigration. It's such an important issue. We know that about 2 million people have been apprehended on the border last year, the year before that, 1.7 million the year before that. That's from Customs and Border Protection, their latest numbers. So if you were sitting in the Senate today, conversing with your colleagues, what would you do? What would you propose to secure that border?
Yeah, here's the thing. All of the laws are in place. We have an executive branch that has one job, right? The president and his people have one job, and that is to enforce the law. They are refusing. I was down at the border a year ago, and border agents told me and the people I was with at the time that 90% of their time, and by the way, this is a completely separate issue from immigration itself, right? I have a son who's lived in Japan for years, and, you know, I could have a daughter-in-law at some point who is not a citizen of the United States of America. We will have to jump through, she will have to jump through massive hoops to come here and stay here legally and become a U.S. citizen if she were to choose to do that.
It could take 10 years to go through
That's
that.
right.
The legal way to do it could take a decade.
And in some countries, like India, it's upwards of 15 years. Yet, if you choose to come in illegally across the southern border, you're here, and we're dealing with the impacts of that. The estimated costs are anywhere from $500 billion, that's $500 billion, and I've heard some numbers up to $1.5 trillion potentially in taking care of these illegal immigrants who come here. The president and his people have all the authority they need to shut down the border. Congress has one thing that they can do. They have the power of the purse. And the people who we have had in Congress who have refused to hold this president accountable to do his one duty, right? This is so fundamental. Not only is it about protecting, about doing his job, but it's about protecting this nation. The physical protection of this nation is the most basic thing that a president or the leaders we elect can deal with.
So how would you enforce along the border and secure it? Are you supporting of building the wall, finishing that wall we've heard so much about from the Trump administration, or would you take a different approach to securing the border?
No, I'll tell you, and every border agent will tell you this as well, that we need a wall in addition to everything else. We need a wall. We need, here's one big reason we need a wall. Right now, 90% of the time of border agents is spent meeting the humanitarian needs of the people who are coming across that border. And by the way, numbers show that upwards of 60% of women and children have been abused, raped, and or trafficked. It's all one and the same in that journey up to the border. We have cartels that are absolutely being enriched. And I had border agents down there tell me that there is an army being built on the southern border, and it is being done by the cartels with all of the additional money that they're making, not only from drugs now, but from the massive waves of human trafficking. So we have to shut down and secure the border. We are incentivizing immoral behavior that is destroying the lives of women and children, and it is absolutely untenable. We have to stop it. Congress, so number one, if we can build that wall, then those agents can be spending their time monitoring and dealing with those areas where a wall can't be built, in addition to electronic surveillance and drones and all these other things. But right now, there are so many areas that are open that it's easy. In fact, a couple of agents told me that this is absolutely a strategy of the cartels, and that is you distract with big groups of women and children who need a whole lot of attention, and we know that's not the majority of the people coming across the border, by the way. It is not women and children. And then you have a wide open border because so many agents, they're humans, right? When you see humans suffering, you address it when you're there and have the capability and ability to do that. So they're doing that. Meanwhile, drugs, we know fentanyl, we have 100,000 deaths a year in this country. I guarantee that number's going up. It's being run across the border in those open areas where nobody is now patrolling.
And I will say Pew Research has said that a lot of the fentanyl and drugs are coming across through the ports of entry. They're being still hidden in cars, hidden in trucks, hidden in buses. How do you address that part of the equation?
Yeah. Here's the thing. We have a completely overburdened system, right? The border agents, whether it is ICE, whether it's Homeland Security, they are completely overburdened because they're spending their time, again, 90% of their time meeting the humanitarian needs. I also have been told by agents here in Utah that additional agents from all over the country are being sent down to the border with six-figure salaries, by the way, to make sandwiches and change diapers. Is that what we've hired these people to do? This is because the behavior taking place at the border is being incentivized by our refusal and our president's refusal, by the way, President Biden, to close down the border, to apply the law as it is written, which is that these people are not to be released while seeking asylum. That's a strategy. Most of them historically have not actually met the definition of asylum, and the numbers are only going up now.
And we know the judges who adjudicate these cases are overwhelmed. We don't have a lot of them. And we could talk about immigration all day, and I'd love to, but only a couple minutes left, and I want to ask you about this. Affordable housing in Utah, it's a crisis here. This is one of the most expensive housing markets in all the country now. It didn't used to be that way just a few years ago. I want to know, what do you think the federal government's role could be in helping Utah, in helping the people of Utah afford homes and be able to afford to live in this beautiful place we call home?
Yeah, I will tell you, the more the government sticks their hands in formerly free markets, the more expensive everything becomes. So I'm not interested in the federal government doing anything except for giving us back the 67% of our lands that they hold and control.
Maybe building housing on public lands. That's the conversation that we're hearing about right now across the country.
I say right now, the state legislature 7 or 8 years ago put money aside to fund a lawsuit for the state against the federal government. The thinking is that it could go directly to the Supreme Court to overturn the law that locks up those lands. It's a law passed in 1976 called FLTMA. You get rid of that and allow the disposal of those lands, which is what the federal government agreed to at the formation of this state. If you get rid of that, we can start developing on lands that are currently held by the federal government. It is a win-win for everybody because we have large swaths of land that are completely unusable and are just sitting.
We got to leave it there, but I know we could talk all day. We're going to push people to your website if they want to learn more about your policy positions on our website, abc4.com. Carolyn Phippen, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
We do appreciate the conversation. Yes, we will be right back, everybody. Stay with us. Thanks so much for joining us here on Inside Utah Politics. You can watch us here every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. You can also find us online at abc4.com under the Inside Utah Politics tab. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time. Take care.